I'm Emma Chen, 29, and I never thought my own brother could make me feel smaller than a grain of rice at a family dinner. "Ooh, face it, Em, you'll never be important," Jake said, cutting into his steak like he was dissecting my entire existence. "Some people are meant to lead, others are meant to follow. Guess which one you are?" I just nodded, swallowing the words I wanted to scream back at him, but that quiet nod became the fuel for the most unexpected phone call of my life, one that would flip our family's understanding of success completely upside down. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Growing up in the Chen household on Maple Street in Riverside meant understanding your place in the family hierarchy from day one. My brother Jake was 3 years older, 6 inches taller, and according to everyone who knew us, infinitely more destined for greatness. While I spent afternoons reading under the old oak tree in our backyard, Jake was quarterback of his high school football team, captain of the debate club, and student body president. He had this magnetic quality that drew people to him like moths to a flame, while I preferred the quiet corners of the library where I could disappear into books about urban planning and community development. Our parents, Robert and Linda Chen, had immigrated from Taiwan in the early 80s with nothing but engineering degrees and endless determination. They built a comfortable middle-class life through sheer willpower, opening a small electronics repair shop that eventually grew into 3 locations across Riverside County. Success, in their eyes, was measured in tangible achievements, grades, titles, salary figures, and most importantly, respect from the community. Jake embodied everything they'd worked toward, while I seemed to represent everything they'd tried to leave behind: quiet, unassuming, content to work behind the scenes rather than command attention. From elementary school onward, the pattern was clear. When Jake scored the winning touchdown, our entire extended family gathered to celebrate at Golden Dragon Restaurant. When I won the regional science fair with my project on sustainable urban agriculture, my parents attended the ceremony but spent most of dinner talking about Jake's latest business plan. By middle school, I'd learned to expect this dynamic. Jake's achievements were family triumphs worthy of phone calls to relatives in Taiwan and framed newspaper clippings on the refrigerator. My accomplishments were nice, but somehow less significant, like background music to the symphony of his success. High school cemented these roles permanently. Jake was accepted to UC Berkeley with a partial football scholarship and plans to major in business economics. The night his acceptance letter arrived, our parents threw an impromptu party that lasted until midnight. I still remember sitting on the back porch, watching through the window as aunts, uncles, and family friends toasted Jake's future with champagne and proud declarations about how he'd become the first Chen to attend such a prestigious university. 3 months later, I received my own acceptance letter to UC Davis with a full academic scholarship for their community development program. When I shared the news at dinner, my father looked up from his newspaper long enough to say, "That's wonderful, Emma. Very practical." My mother added, "Community development is a nice field for women, stable, not too demanding." Jake, halfway through his senior year and already acting like a college graduate, patted my shoulder condescendingly. "Good for you, little sister. Someone has to do the support jobs while the rest of us change the world." Even then, I didn't feel angry. I felt resigned. This was simply how our family worked. Jake was the star, I was the supporting cast member, and everyone seemed comfortable with this arrangement, except maybe me, though I was too young and too conditioned to recognize my own discomfort. College offered a brief respite from this dynamic. At UC Davis, I discovered professors who valued my analytical mind and my passion for community organizing. I spent summers interning with housing nonprofits and environmental justice organizations, learning how policy could transform neighborhoods and how grassroots organizing could shift power structure. For 4 years, I was simply Emma Chen, not Jake's little sister or Robert and Linda's quieter daughter. I was a person with ideas and abilities that mattered to the people around me, but family dynamics have a gravitational pull that's hard to escape. After graduation, I moved back to Riverside and took a position with the Riverside Community Development Center, a small nonprofit focused on affordable housing and environmental sustainability. The work was meaningful, but the pay was modest, and the prestige factor was essentially non-existent. Meanwhile, Jake had leveraged his Berkeley connections into a high-paying position with a commercial real estate firm in Los Angeles. Within 2 years, he was making more money than both our parents combined, and driving a BMW that he parked prominently in their driveway during family visits. The contrast became the subject of every family gathering. At birthday parties and holiday celebrations, relatives would ask Jake about his latest deals and commissions, while inquiring politely about my volunteer work, as if community development was a hobby rather than a career. When Jake bought his first condo in Santa Monica at 26, the family treated it like a national holiday. When I was promoted to program coordinator at 27, overseeing 3 major community revitalization projects, the news merited a brief congratulations before the conversation shifted to Jake's plans for property investment. I told myself I didn't care about the recognition. The work itself was rewarding enough. Through the Community Development Center, I'd helped secure funding for a new playground in the Oakwood neighborhood, organized tenants to fight against unfair rent increases, and coordinated with city planners to ensure that new development projects included affordable housing component. The families I worked with knew my name and appreciated my efforts. Children played on equipment I'd helped fund. Elderly residents attended city council meetings because I'd taught them how to navigate the system. This impact felt more meaningful than any salary or family approval. But there were moments when the disparity stung sharply, like when Jake casually mentioned purchasing a second property as an investment while I was calculating whether I could afford to replace my 10-year-old Honda Civic, or when our parents attended his company's annual gala, proudly introducing him to their friends as our son the real estate executive, while consistently describing my work as helping people in the community as if it were a charitable hobby rather than a professional expertise. The most painful moments came during family dinners when Jake would hold court about market trends and development opportunities, while I sat quietly, knowing that my insights about community impact and sustainable development weren't valued in these conversations. He had a way of dominating discussions that felt effortless and natural, drawing our parents' attention like a magnet, while I faded into the background of my own family's attention. By my late 20s, I'd developed sophisticated coping mechanisms for managing these feelings. I focused intensely on my work, building relationships with community leaders and city council members who understood the value of grassroots organizing. I cultivated friendships outside my family circle, particularly with my colleague Maya Rodriguez, who became not just a work partner but a genuine source of support and understanding. Maya had grown up in a similar dynamic with siblings who pursued more traditionally prestigious careers, and she understood the particular pain of being overlooked by the people whose approval you'd unconsciously spent your life seeking. My apartment in the Sunset Gardens complex became my sanctuary, a small one-bedroom space I'd furnished with pieces from thrift stores and plants I'd nurtured from seedling. Every evening after work, I'd sit on my tiny balcony with a cup of tea, reviewing the day's progress on whatever project was consuming my energy. These quiet moments felt like the only time I could exist as myself rather than as the less successful Chen sibling, the one who'd chosen meaning over money and impact over prestige. But even in my carefully constructed independent life, family dynamics had a way of infiltrating my peace. During weekly phone calls with my parents, they'd ask dutiful questions about my work before spending the majority of the conversation updating me on Jake's latest achievement. He'd been promoted to senior associate. He was considering business school. He'd been featured in a trade publication article about young professionals in commercial real estate. Each update felt like a small reminder of the gap between his trajectory and mine, though I'd become skilled at offering appropriate enthusiasm while protecting my own emotional equilibrium. The dynamic reached its breaking point on a warm Thursday evening in September. Our parents had invited both Jake and me for dinner to celebrate their 35th wedding anniversary. I'd spent the afternoon finishing a grant proposal for a new community garden project and was genuinely excited to share the news with my family. The proposal represented 6 months of research, community meetings, and collaboration with environmental groups, and if approved, it would transform an abandoned lot in the Oakwood neighborhood into a space where residents could grow their own food while learning about sustainable agriculture. I arrived at the house on Maple Street carrying a small potted orchid for my mother and photocopies of the grant proposal, thinking perhaps this would be the moment when my parents would see the significance of my work. Jake's BMW was already in the driveway, and through the front window I could see him gesturing animatedly while our parents listened with rapt attention. Walking into the living room, I caught the tail end of his story about closing a particularly challenging deal that would net him a substantial commission. Our parents were beaming with pride and my father was already reaching for his phone to call Uncle Richard with the news. "Emma," my mother exclaimed when she noticed me. "Perfect timing. Jake was just telling us about his promotion to junior partner track." I offered congratulations that felt genuine despite the familiar pang of being perpetually arriving at the end of someone else's success story. During dinner, Jake dominated the conversation with details about his expanding client base and plans for purchasing a larger property in Manhattan Beach. Our parents hung on every word, asking thoughtful questions about market conditions and investment strategy. When there was finally a lull in the conversation, I mentioned the grant proposal and the potential for creating the first community-managed food garden in Riverside. My father nodded politely. "That sounds nice, Emma. Very community-minded." My mother added, "It's wonderful that you're helping people with their hobbies." Jake looked up from his wine glass with an expression I'd seen countless times before, the particular blend of condescension and amusement he reserved for my professional endeavor. "That's sweet, Em," he said, his tone suggesting he was addressing a child who'd just shown him a finger painting. "But let's be honest about the difference between what we do. I'm moving millions of dollars in real estate transactions that create jobs and drive economic development. You're organizing vegetable gardens. Both have their place, but only one actually matters in the big picture." The familiar sting of dismissal washed over me, but something felt different this time. Maybe it was the months of successful project management, or the growing recognition I'd been receiving from city officials, or simply the accumulation of years of having my work minimized. Instead of my usual diplomatic response, I found myself saying, "Actually, community development creates long-term economic stability and addresses systemic inequality in ways that pure market-driven development often can't." Jake laughed, not maliciously, but with the confidence of someone who'd never questioned. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. His own importance. "Come on, Emma. We both know you're never going to be important enough to influence real policy or make decisions that actually matter. You're great at the small stuff, the feel-good projects that make people feel better about poverty and inequality without actually changing anything fundamental. But face it, Em, you'll never be important. Some people are meant to lead. Others are meant to follow. Guess which one you are." The words hung in the air like smoke from a fire nobody wanted to acknowledge. Our parents continued eating as if nothing significant had happened, perhaps hoping the moment would pass without requiring them to choose sides or confront the dynamics they'd helped create. I looked around the table at these three people who were supposed to know me better than anyone else in the world, and realized that they saw me exactly as Jake had described. Nice, harmless, ultimately insignificant. Instead of arguing or defending myself or pointing out the condescension in his tone, I simply nodded. "You're probably right," I said quietly. Cutting a piece of chicken and focusing on my plate, the conversation moved on to other topics, but something fundamental had shifted inside me. For the first time I'd heard the family narrative about my limitations stated so clearly and directly, and instead of accepting it, I felt a spark of defiance that surprised me with its intensity. I finished dinner, helped clear the dishes, kissed my parents goodbye, and drove home to my apartment in complete silence. But that quiet car ride wasn't filled with the usual resignation or hurt feeling. Instead, I felt a curious sense of clarity, as if Jake had inadvertently given me permission to stop trying to earn respect from people who'd already decided I wasn't worthy of it. That night, sitting on my balcony with the grant proposal spread across my lap, I made a decision that would change everything. I was done trying to prove my worth to my family, and ready to focus entirely on proving it to myself and the community that actually valued my contribution. The next morning, I submitted the grant proposal with a cover letter that was more confident and comprehensive than anything I'd written before. But more importantly, I started paying attention to opportunities I'd previously overlooked, particularly ways to amplify the impact of community development work through policy advocacy and political engagement. If Jake thought I'd never be important enough to influence real decisions, I was suddenly very curious about testing that assumption in ways that might surprise all of us. The weeks following that dinner felt like walking through my life with new glasses, suddenly seeing patterns that had been invisible before. Jake's words echoed in my mind not as a wound but as a challenge, and I found myself approaching my work at the Riverside Community Development Center with renewed intensity. Maya Rodriguez noticed the change immediately when I walked into our shared office space the Monday morning after the anniversary dinner. "You look different," she said, glancing up from her computer screen where she was reviewing housing inspection reports. "Like you've made some kind of decision." Maya had become my closest colleague over the past 3 years, and her instinct for reading people was one of the reasons she excelled at community organizing. She'd grown up in East Los Angeles, the daughter of immigrants who'd worked multiple jobs to put her through UCLA's urban planning program. Unlike me, Maya had never struggled with family recognition because her parents understood exactly how hard-won her position was and what it meant for their community. But she'd watched me navigate the particular pain of being professionally accomplished yet personally overlooked, and she'd developed a protective instinct that I treasure. "I think I'm done being small," I told her, settling into my desk chair and opening the files for our current affordable housing project. "Done making excuses for why my work matters. Done accepting that community development is somehow less important than moving money around for wealthy developers." Maya leaned back in her chair, a slow smile spreading across her face. "It's about time. What happened?" I told her about Jake's comment, watching her expression shift from sympathy to indignation to something that looked remarkably like excitement. "So he basically said, 'You'll never be important enough to make real change,'" she summarized. "And instead of letting that destroy you, you're treating it like a research question." "Exactly. I want to know what important actually means, and whether he's right about my limitation." That conversation launched what Maya and I started calling Project Significance, though we kept the name between ourselves. Instead of simply executing the programs assigned to us by the Community Development Center, we began actively seeking opportunities to expand our influence and impact. We started attending city council meetings, not just as observers, but as informed advocates, researching policy proposals and preparing testimony that connected individual community needs to broader municipal priorities. The first time I spoke during public comment at a city council meeting, my voice shook slightly as I addressed the 5 council members about the need for stronger tenant protection ordinance. I'd spent hours preparing my 3-minute presentation, backing up personal stories from Oakwood residents with data about displacement patterns and economic stability. After I finished speaking, Councilwoman Patricia Williams approached me in the hallway. "Ms. Chen, your presentation tonight was exactly the kind of informed advocacy we need more of in this city," she said, extending her hand for a firm handshake. "I've been looking for community voices who understand both the human impact and the policy mechanisms needed to address housing insecurity. Would you be interested in joining our Housing Policy Advisory Committee?" Patricia Williams was a woman I'd admired from a distance for years. In her mid-50s, she'd served on the city council for 8 years after building a successful law practice focused on municipal law and community development. She had a reputation for being both pragmatic and principled, capable of building coalitions across political divides while never compromising on issues of equity and justice. Her invitation felt like recognition from someone whose opinion actually mattered in the corridors of power. "I'd been observing from the outside. I'd be honored," I replied, trying to keep the excitement out of my voice while internally celebrating this unexpected opportunity. The Housing Policy Advisory Committee met twice monthly in the conference room adjacent to the mayor's office, and joining it introduced me to a network of professionals I'd never encountered through my nonprofit work. There were developers who specialized in affordable housing, city planners working on zoning reform, attorneys focused on tenant rights, and community organizers from neighborhoods across Riverside. For the first time in my career, I was in rooms where policy was actually crafted rather than simply implemented, and I discovered that my combination of grassroots experience and analytical skills was both rare and valuable. Within 6 months of joining the committee, I'd authored 2 policy recommendations that were adopted by the City Council. The first established a community land trust pilot program that would allow neighborhoods to maintain affordable housing in perpetuity, even as surrounding property values increase. The second created a streamlined permitting process for community gardens and urban agriculture projects, removing bureaucratic barriers that had prevented residents from transforming vacant lots into productive green spaces. Each policy victory felt like evidence against Jake's prediction about my limitations, but more importantly, I was discovering that the work itself energized me in ways I'd never experienced. There was something intoxicating about seeing ideas translate into concrete changes that would improve people's lives for years to come. When the Community Land Trust pilot program received preliminary approval, I called Maya from the parking lot outside City Hall, barely able to contain my excitement. They voted yes, I told her, standing next to my aging Honda Civic while watching council members exit the building after the meeting. 4-1 in favor, with Councilman Martinez asking if we can expand the program to 3 additional neighborhoods next year. Emma, do you realize what you just accomplished? Maya's voice carried the same excitement I was feeling. You literally changed city policy. You took an idea from concept to implementation in 6 months. That's not small, that's transformation. The word transformational stuck with me as I drove home that evening. For most of my life, I'd thought of transformation as something that happened to other people, the kind of dramatic personal evolution that belonged to Jake and people like him who seemed naturally destined for significance. But sitting in traffic on the 91 freeway, I realized that I'd been experiencing my own transformation over the past several months. It wasn't the loud, attention-grabbing kind that would merit phone calls to relatives in Taiwan, but it was real and substantial and entirely my own creation. At the same time, my family remained completely unaware of these developments. During our weekly phone calls, my parents continued to update me on Jake's achievements while asking perfunctory questions about my work with the community. When I mentioned being appointed to the Housing Policy Advisory Committee, my mother responded, "That sounds like a nice volunteer opportunity. Are you still getting paid for your regular job?" When I explained that the committee was an official city position that involved writing policy recommendations, my father said, "Just be careful not to get too involved in politics, Emma. It can be controversial." The disconnect between my family's perception and my actual accomplishments became more pronounced as my influence within city government grew. By the end of my first year on the advisory committee, I'd been invited to join 2 additional task forces, one focused on environmental sustainability, and another addressing small business development in underserved neighborhoods. My calendar filled with meetings. My evenings were spent reviewing policy documents and preparing presentations, and my weekends often included community forums where residents could voice concerns about proposed changes to city ordinance. Maya observed this evolution with a mixture of pride and concern. "You're becoming exactly the kind of person Jake said you'd never be," she told me one evening as we worked late on a comprehensive report about inclusionary zoning. "But I hope you're doing this for yourself and not just to prove him wrong." Her question forced me to examine my motivations more honestly. While the initial spark had definitely come from wanting to challenge Jake's dismissive assessment of my potential, the work itself had become genuinely compelling. I was discovering talents and interests I'd never fully explored, finding that I had an intuitive understanding of how to build consensus among diverse stakeholders and translate complex policy concepts into language that regular citizens could understand and support. More importantly, I was seeing concrete results from my efforts. The community garden project I'd written about in my grant proposal had not only been funded, but had become a model for similar initiatives in 3 neighboring cities. The affordable housing units created through the Community Land Trust were providing stable homes for families who otherwise would have been displaced by rising rent. The Small Business Development Task Force had successfully advocated for micro-loan programs that were helping local entrepreneurs expand their operations and hire additional employees. These accomplishments felt fundamentally different from the recognition I'd craved from my family. Instead of seeking approval from people who seemed predetermined to overlook my contributions, I was earning respect from individuals who understood the complexity and importance of the work itself. City council members sought my input on housing legislation. Community organizations requested my assistance with policy advocacy. Local newspapers quoted my analysis of municipal development trends. The shift in my professional identity became especially apparent during a regional conference on sustainable urban development held in downtown Los Angeles. I'd been invited to present a workshop on community-driven policy development, sharing the strategies we'd used in Riverside to ensure that residents had meaningful input into decisions affecting their neighborhood. Standing in front of 60 urban planners, policy analysts, and community organizers from across Southern California, I felt a confidence I'd never experienced before. Community development isn't just about implementing programs, I told the audience during my presentation. It's about fundamentally shifting who gets to make decisions about neighborhood change and ensuring that the people most affected by policy have the strongest voices in creating it. After the workshop, several attendees approached me with questions about replicating our model in their own cities. A policy analyst from San Diego asked if I'd be willing to consult on their affordable housing strategy. A community organizer from Santa Barbara wanted to know if I could provide training for resident leaders in her neighborhood. Most surprisingly, a representative from the California Department of Housing and Community Development inquired about my interest in joining a statewide task force on innovative approaches to affordable housing preservation. These conversations represented a level of professional recognition that extended far beyond Riverside and positioned me within networks of influence I'd never imagined access. Driving back to Riverside after the conference, I realized that I'd somehow become the kind of person who was consulted by government agencies and invited to share expertise at regional events. The transformation felt both gradual and sudden, as if I'd been building toward this moment for years without fully recognizing the trajectory. But the most meaningful validation came from the residents whose lives were directly affected by the policies I'd helped create. Miss Elena Vasquez, a grandmother who'd been facing eviction from her apartment in the Oakwood neighborhood, was among the first families to benefit from the stronger tenant protection ordinance. When she saw me at the grocery store several months after the policy took effect, she stopped her shopping cart in the middle of the produce section to thank me. "Miss Emma, because of what you did at the city meetings, my landlord couldn't force us out when he wanted to raise our rent by $300, she said, her eyes bright with gratitude. "My granddaughter can finish high school in the same neighborhood where she's grown up. You saved our family from having to start over somewhere we couldn't afford." Moments like these reminded me why the work mattered beyond any personal validation or family recognition. Policy changes weren't abstract concepts but concrete interventions that allowed families to maintain stability and communities to resist displacement. The Community Land Trust, that had seemed like such a bureaucratic achievement, was enabling people like Miss Vasquez to remain in neighborhoods where they'd built lives and relationships, where their children could walk to school and their elderly parents could receive support from familiar networks. Maya often said that policy work was like planting trees. You rarely saw immediate results, but the long-term impact could be transformational for entire generations. As I approached the 2-year mark of my involvement with city government, I was beginning to see the early growth of some of the seeds we'd planted. The pilot programs were succeeding beyond initial projections. Other municipalities were requesting information about our innovative approach, and residents were increasingly engaged in local political processes because they'd seen evidence that their participation could lead to meaningful change. Yet throughout this period of professional growth and community impact, my family remained largely oblivious to the scope of my accomplishments. Jake continued to dominate family conversations with updates about his real estate transactions and expansion plans. Our parents still introduced me to their friends as our daughter who works with community groups, while describing Jake as our son, the successful businessman. During a particularly frustrating phone call with my mother, I found myself tempted to list my recent achievements, the policy victories, the conference presentations, the recognition from state-level officials, but something held me back from making that argument. Perhaps it was the realization that their approval wasn't actually necessary for my work to have value and impact. Or maybe it was the understanding that true significance couldn't be measured by family recognition or relative status within sibling dynamics. The families whose housing stability I'd helped protect didn't care whether my parents understood the importance of policy advocacy. The small business owners who'd accessed microloans through programs I'd helped create weren't interested in my relationship with Jake. For the first time in my life, I was building an identity that existed entirely independent of family validation. The work itself had become its own reward, and the growing recognition from colleagues and community members provided a form of affirmation that felt more substantial than any dinner table praise could have offered. I was discovering that importance wasn't something other people granted you, but something you created through the accumulated impact of your choices and efforts. This shift in perspective became particularly clear during a strategic planning meeting for the Community Development Center. Our executive director was outlining budget constraints and program priorities for the upcoming year when she mentioned that the city had requested our organization to take the lead on implementing a new affordable housing trust fund. The position would require someone with policy experience, community connections, and the ability to navigate both grassroots organizing and municipal bureaucracy. "Emma, this seems like a natural fit for your skill set and interests," she said, looking across the conference table where I sat with Maya and our other colleagues. The role would involve significant collaboration with city council members and housing developers, as well as ongoing community engagement. It's essentially a bridge position between advocacy and implementation. The job description she outlined was exactly the kind of opportunity Jake had suggested I'd never be qualified to pursue: high-level policy work with real decision-making authority and substantial budget oversight. As she detailed the responsibilities and expectations, I felt a familiar spark of excitement, combined with something new, absolute confidence that I could succeed in this role not despite my background, but because of it. After the meeting, Maya and I walked to the coffee shop across the street from our office to discuss this unexpected development. "You're going to apply, right?" she asked, stirring honey into her latte while studying my expression. "I think I'm going to do more than apply," I replied, surprising myself with the decisiveness in my voice. "I think I'm going to design a vision for this position that goes beyond what they're currently imagining, something that could become a model for other cities and really demonstrate what community-driven policy development can accomplish." Maya grinned and raised her coffee cup in a mock toast. "To Emma Chen, future Director of Transformational Change and living proof that importance isn't inherited but earned." As we sat in that coffee shop surrounded by the afternoon bustle of downtown Riverside, I realized that Jake's prediction about my limitations had become the catalyst for discovering capabilities I'd never fully explored. Instead of accepting his assessment of my potential, I'd used it as motivation to test the boundaries of what I could accomplish. The question was no longer whether I'd ever be important enough to make real change, but how much change I was prepared to create, and whether my family would eventually recognize what I'd been building while they weren't paying attention. The application process for the Affordable Housing Trust Fund director position forced me to articulate my vision in ways I'd never attempted before. Rather than simply responding to the job requirements, I spent 3 weeks crafting a comprehensive proposal that outlined how Riverside could become a statewide model for community-driven housing policy. The document detailed innovative financing mechanisms, resident leadership development programs, and partnerships with local universities that could provide ongoing research and evaluation support. Maya read through multiple drafts, offering feedback that pushed me to be even more ambitious in my recommendations. "You're thinking too small," she said during one of our evening revision sessions. "If you're going to propose something transformational, don't hedge your bet. Show them exactly how revolutionary this could be." Her encouragement helped me include elements I'd initially considered too bold: a resident council with voting power over fund allocation decisions, a pipeline program connecting high school students to urban planning career, and a technology platform that would allow real-time community input on proposed developments. By the time I submitted the application, it read less like a job proposal and more like a manifesto for reshaping how cities approach affordable housing. The interview process extended over 6 weeks and included presentations to multiple stakeholder groups. I found myself in conference rooms with city council members, affordable housing developers, tenant advocacy organizations, and resident leaders from across Riverside's diverse neighborhood. Each presentation required adapting my message to different audiences while maintaining the core vision of community-centered policy development. The most challenging interview came with a panel that included the mayor's chief of staff, the city's economic development director, and representatives from 2 major housing development firms. These were people accustomed to dealing with multi-million-dollar budgets and complex regulatory frameworks, and I could feel them evaluating whether someone with my background could handle the political and financial pressures of the position. Chen, the economic development director, began, "Your proposal includes some innovative ideas, but implementing them would require navigating significant political complexity. How do you plan to build consensus among stakeholders who may have conflicting interests regarding affordable housing development?" The question was clearly designed to test whether I understood the realities of municipal politics beyond community organizing. I took a breath and drew on everything I'd learned during my 2 years of policy committee work. In my experience, conflicts around affordable housing usually stem from stakeholders operating with different information and assumptions. I replied, "Developers worry about financial feasibility, residents worry about displacement and community character, and city officials worry about budget impacts and political fallout. My approach involves creating structured opportunities for these groups to share their concerns and constraints directly with each other, then collaboratively developing solutions that address multiple needs simultaneously." I went on to describe specific examples from recent policy victories, explaining how we'd brought together skeptical developers and concerned residents to design inclusionary zoning requirements that actually worked for both groups. The panel members took notes and asked follow-up questions that suggested genuine interest rather than polite skepticism. 2 weeks later, I received a call from Patricia Williams asking if I could meet with her at City Hall. When I arrived at her office, she was reviewing a thick folder that I recognized as my application materials. "Emma, I want you to know that your proposal was by far the most comprehensive and innovative submission we received," she said, gesturing for me to take a seat across from her desk. "The selection committee was unanimous in our decision to offer you the position, but I wanted to discuss expectations before we make the formal announcement." She outlined the scope of the role in detail, emphasizing both the opportunities and the challenges ahead. The trust fund represented a $20 million commitment from the city, with additional federal and state funding contingent on successful implementation of the pilot program. Success would position Riverside as a national leader in affordable housing innovation, while failure would set back similar efforts across the region. "This isn't just a job," Patricia explained. "It's an opportunity to demonstrate that community-driven policy development can work at scale. But it also means you'll be under intense scrutiny from colleagues in other cities, housing advocates, and political opponents who would prefer that our approach fail." The weight of responsibility she was describing should have felt overwhelming, but instead, it energized me. This was exactly the kind of significance I'd been working toward, the chance to create change that extended far beyond individual families or neighborhoods to influence how entire systems operated. "I understand the challenges," I told her, "and I'm ready for them. This is the work I've been preparing for my entire career, even when I didn't fully realize it." Patricia smiled and extended her hand for a congratulatory handshake. "Welcome to the big leagues, Emma. Your first day is Monday, and we'll be announcing your appointment at Thursday's city council meeting." The news felt too significant to process immediately. I walked through downtown Riverside in a daze, stopping at the community garden that had been my first major policy success. Seeing families tending vegetables in what had once been an abandoned lot reminded me of why this work mattered beyond any personal achievement. But I also couldn't deny the satisfaction of knowing that Jake's prediction about my limitations had been so thoroughly disproven. Maya's reaction when I called her with the news was characteristically direct. "Holy shit, Emma, Do you realize you just became one of the most influential people in Riverside's municipal government? This is huge. Her excitement was infectious, and for the first time, I allowed myself to fully appreciate the magnitude of what I'd accomplished. Within 3 years of Jake's dismissive dinner table comment, I'd evolved from a community development coordinator into a senior policy director with substantial budget authority and regional influence. The transformation felt both impossible and inevitable, as if I'd been unconsciously building toward this moment while focusing on the day-to-day work of community organizing. But even as I celebrated this professional milestone, I found myself curious about how my family would respond to the news. For years I'd stopped expecting recognition from my parents and Jake, but this felt different. The position came with a title and salary that matched conventional measures of success, along with responsibilities that even Jake couldn't dismiss as small stuff. I decided to wait until the official announcement before sharing the news with my family. Part of me wanted to savor this achievement privately before submitting it to their judgment, and another part was genuinely curious whether they would finally acknowledge the significance of my work when it came with the kind of authority and visibility they seemed to value. The city council meeting where my appointment was announced drew a larger crowd than usual. Representatives from tenant organizations, affordable housing developers, environmental groups, and neighborhood associations filled the council chambers to capacity. Maya sat in the front row beaming with pride as Patricia Williams introduced me as the driving force behind Riverside's most successful community development initiatives over the past 3 years. Standing at the podium to address the council and audience, I felt a confidence that had been building gradually but was now fully crystallized. This wasn't the nervous graduate student who'd hesitantly spoken at her first city council meeting, or even the policy committee member who'd carefully prepared talking points to advocate for specific ordinances. I was now someone whose expertise was recognized by elected officials, whose vision was trusted with significant public resources, and whose leadership was seen as essential to addressing one of the region's most complex challenges. Affordable housing isn't just about providing shelter, I told the audience during my brief acceptance remarks. It's about ensuring that our community's economic growth benefits all residents, not just those who already have access to wealth and opportunity. This trust fund represents our commitment to building a city where families can remain in neighborhoods they've helped create, where young people can afford to live near their parents as adults, and where economic development strengthens communities rather than displacing them. The applause that followed felt different from the polite recognition I'd received for previous accomplishments. This was the kind of response reserved for people whose words carried actual policy weight, whose ideas would translate directly into programs, affecting thousands of residents over the coming decade. After the meeting, I was approached by reporters from 3 local news outlets and a freelance journalist who covered housing issues for regional publications. Their questions demonstrated that my appointment was being seen as newsworthy beyond typical municipal personnel change. The Riverside Press Enterprise was planning a feature story about innovative approaches to affordable housing, and a policy analyst from UCLA had requested an interview about community-driven development strategies. This level of attention was entirely new territory for me. Throughout my career in community development, my work had been visible primarily to residents directly affected by specific programs and policy. Now I was being positioned as a spokesperson for an approach that could influence housing policy across California and potentially serve as a model for other states facing similar affordability crises. The transition into my new role required adapting to responsibilities I'd only observed from the periphery. Instead of attending city council meetings as an advocate or advisor, I was now briefing council members on policy options and budget implications. Rather than organizing residents to testify about housing needs, I was synthesizing their input into comprehensive reports that would guide multi-million-dollar investment decisions. The learning curve was steep, but exhilarating. My first month involved meeting with housing developers to understand financing mechanisms, reviewing federal compliance requirements for affordable housing programs, and establishing partnerships with nonprofit organizations that would implement various components of our comprehensive strategy. Each day brought new challenges that required combining analytical skills with relationship-building abilities and creative problem-solving approaches. Maya, who had been promoted to fill my previous position at the Community Development Center, became my closest collaborator as we worked to ensure continuity between grassroots organizing and policy implementation. Our weekly check-ins often extended into evening strategy sessions where we analyzed the political dynamics surrounding specific proposals and brainstormed approaches for building broader community support. You've become the person everyone comes to when they need housing policy questions answered, Maya observed during one of these conversations. City council members, developers, advocacy groups, they all want your input because you understand both the technical aspects and the community impact. Her observation highlighted something I was gradually recognizing about my evolving role. The combination of policy expertise and grassroots experience had positioned me as a bridge between constituencies that often operated in isolation from each other. Developers respected my understanding of financing and regulatory frameworks, while community organizations trusted my commitment to resident-centered approaches. City officials valued my ability to translate complex policy concepts into politically viable proposals that addressed multiple stakeholder concerns simultaneously. This unique positioning became especially valuable as we began implementing the Trust Fund's first major initiative, a scattered site affordable housing program that would integrate income-restricted units throughout existing neighborhoods, rather than concentrating them in specific areas. The approach required extensive community engagement to address concerns about property values and neighborhood character, while also working with developers to create financially sustainable projects that met affordability requirements. The community meetings I facilitated for this initiative drew hundreds of residents from across Riverside's demographic spectrum. Homeowners worried about how affordable housing might affect their property value. Renters facing displacements sought assurance that new units would actually be accessible to people like them, and longtime residents expressed concerns about preserving neighborhood character while accommodating growth. Managing these complex conversations required skills I'd been developing throughout my community organizing career, but the stakes felt significantly higher now that I was representing official city policy rather than simply advocating for specific change. Every response I gave would be analyzed not just by meeting attendees but by council members, local media, and housing advocates monitoring our progress from other municipalities. The most challenging meeting took place in the Magnolia neighborhood, where residents had organized opposition to a proposed 40-unit affordable housing development. The project included innovative design features that would blend seamlessly with existing architecture, along with community amenities like a shared garden and childcare facility, but skeptical neighbors had circulated petition demanding that the city reconsider the site selection. Standing before an audience of nearly 200 residents in the Magnolia Elementary School gymnasium, I could feel the tension in the room before I'd spoken a single word. Signs reading "Preserve our neighborhood character" and "Affordable housing belongs elsewhere" were scattered throughout the crowd, and several residents had prepared detailed presentations arguing against the development. Rather than beginning with a defense of the proposed project, I started by acknowledging the concerns I'd heard during individual conversations with neighbors over the previous week. I understand that many of you are worried about how this development might change your neighborhood, I said, making eye contact with specific individuals who'd expressed concerns during our one-on-one meeting. These are legitimate concerns that deserve thoughtful responses, not dismissive platitudes about the greater good. I spent the first 30 minutes of the meeting simply listening as residents voiced their fears and frustrations. Some worried about increased traffic and parking constraints. Others questioned whether the development would actually serve local families or attract residents from other areas, and several expressed broader anxieties about rapid growth changing the character of neighborhoods they'd chosen specifically for their quiet residential atmosphere. Once everyone who wanted to speak had been heard, I began addressing their concerns with specific details about the project design and implementation plan. The development would include deed restrictions, ensuring that units remained affordable in perpetuity, with priority given to families who already lived or worked in Riverside. Traffic studies indicated minimal impact on existing congestion patterns, and the design included adequate parking for residents while encouraging alternative transportation options. But the most important part of my presentation focused on the broader context of housing affordability in Riverside. Using data visualizations I'd prepared specifically for this meeting, I showed how median housing costs had increased by 40% over the past 5 years, while average incomes had remained relatively stable. Teachers, firefighters, retail workers, and other essential employees were increasingly unable to afford living in the communities they served, creating longer commutes and reduced civic engagement. The question isn't whether we'll have affordable housing in Riverside, I explained, clicking through slides that illustrated demographic and economic trends. The question is whether we'll plan for it thoughtfully, in ways that strengthen communities and preserve neighborhood character, or whether we'll ignore it until families are forced to leave and essential workers can't afford to live here at all. The shift in the room's energy was gradual but unmistakable, as residents began asking detailed questions about design features, tenant selection processes, and long-term maintenance responsibilities. The conversation evolved from opposition to collaborative problem-solving. Several neighbors who'd initially opposed the project began suggesting modifications that could address their concerns while maintaining the development's affordability goal. By the end of the 3-hour meeting, we'd reached consensus on a modified proposal that incorporated community input while preserving the project's core mission. The developer would adjust the building orientation to minimize visual impact from the street. Residents would have ongoing input through a neighborhood advisory committee, and the community garden would be designed to encourage interaction between new and existing neighbors. Walking to my car after that meeting, I felt a sense of accomplishment that went beyond any previous professional success. The evening had demonstrated that thoughtful community engagement could transform opposition into collaboration, but it had also revealed capabilities I'd been developing without fully recognizing them. The skills required to facilitate that conversation, bridging policy expertise with emotional intelligence, managing conflict while building consensus, communicating complex information in accessible ways, were exactly the leadership abilities Jake had suggested I'd never possessed. The successful resolution of the Magnolia neighborhood controversy became a template for future community engagement efforts. Word spread through municipal networks about Riverside's innovative approach to addressing NB resistance, and I began receiving invitations to present our strategies at conferences and policy forums throughout California. The Los Angeles Times featured our scattered site housing program in a series about creative solutions to the state's affordability crisis, and the California Department of Housing and Community Development invited me to join a statewide advisory panel on community engagement best practice. Each of these recognition opportunities felt like evidence of a transformation I could hardly have imagined 3 years earlier. The quiet community development coordinator who'd struggled for family recognition had evolved into a regional expert whose opinion was sought by elected officials, journalists, and policy research. But more importantly, the work itself continued to energize me in ways that felt sustainable and deeply meaningful. The most satisfying moments came from seeing individual families benefit from policies I'd helped create. When Rosa Martinez received keys to her new apartment through the Scattered Site program, she stopped by my office to share photos of her 8-year-old daughter's bedroom. She's never had her own room before, Rosa explained, her eyes bright with excitement. And now she can stay in the same school district where all her friends are. Stories like Rosa's reminded me that policy work, for all its complexity and bureaucratic challenges, ultimately came down to enabling people to build stable, dignified lives in communities they value. The abstract concepts we debated in committee meetings translated into concrete improvements in housing security, educational continuity, and economic mobility for families across Riverside. As I approached the 1-year anniversary of my appointment as trust fund director, I reflected on how dramatically my professional identity had evolved. The woman who'd once accepted her brother's assessment of her limitations had become someone whose expertise was recognized far beyond her own city's boundary. But perhaps more importantly, I'd discovered that significance wasn't something others granted you based on their perception of your potential. It was something you created through persistent effort, strategic thinking, and commitment to goals larger than personal advancement. The question that had begun to occupy my thoughts wasn't whether my family would ever recognize these accomplishments, but whether their recognition mattered at all when measured against the concrete impact I was having on hundreds of families and the broader influence my work was beginning to have on housing policy throughout the region. For the first time in my life, I was building an identity that existed entirely independent of family validation, and that independence felt like its own form of success. The phone call that would change everything came on a Tuesday morning in October, 18 months after I'd started my role as director of Riverside's Affordable Housing Trust Fund. I was reviewing budget projections for our next phase of development when my assistant knocked on my office door with an expression that suggested something significant was happening. "Emma, there's someone from the mayor's office online too," she said, her voice carrying the kind of excitement that indicated this wasn't a routine call about policy coordination. "She says it's urgent and asked if you could speak with them immediately." Mayor Catherine Rodriguez had been a supportive ally throughout my tenure as trust fund director, but we typically communicated through scheduled meetings or policy briefings, rather than unexpected phone calls. I picked up the line with curiosity mixed with slight apprehension, wondering if some crisis had emerged that required immediate attention. "Emma, this is Sarah Chen from Mayor Rodriguez's office," the voice began, and I noticed immediately that she shared my surname, though we'd never met. "The mayor would like to meet with you this afternoon if possible. She has a proposal that could significantly expand the scope of your current work, but she'd prefer to discuss it in person rather than over the phone." The mysterious nature of the request intrigued me, especially given the timing. Our affordable housing initiatives had been performing exceptionally well, exceeding projected outcomes for both unit production and community satisfaction measures. Recent reports showed that 93% of families placed through our programs had maintained stable housing for over a year, while neighborhood integration surveys indicated minimal conflict and several examples of cross-income community building. I agreed to meet with Mayor Rodriguez at 4 o'clock that afternoon, spending the intervening hours wondering what kind of expansion she might be considering. Perhaps additional funding had become available through state or federal sources, or maybe other municipalities were interested in replicating our model through some kind of regional partnership. Walking into the mayor's office that afternoon, I was surprised to find not just Mayor Rodriguez but also her chief of staff, the city manager, and two people I didn't recognize wearing suits that suggested they represented organizations beyond Riverside's municipal government. The formal nature of the gathering indicated that whatever was being proposed would be significantly more substantial than I'd anticipated. "Emma, thank you for coming on short notice," Mayor Rodriguez began, gesturing for me to take a seat at the conference table where the others had assembled. "I want you to meet Jennifer Walsh from the California Department of Housing and Community Development, and Marcus Thompson from the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. They've been following your work here in Riverside with considerable interest." Jennifer Walsh leaned forward with a warm smile that suggested good news was coming. "Ms. Chen, your innovative approach to community-driven affordable housing policy has attracted attention at both state and federal level. The scattered site integration model you've developed, combined with your community engagement strategies, represents exactly the kind of breakthrough thinking we need to address California's housing crisis at scale." Marcus Thompson nodded in agreement, opening a folder that contained what appeared to be detailed reports about our programs. "The preliminary evaluation data from Riverside's trust fund initiatives shows outcomes that surpass anything we've seen from comparable programs nationwide. Your cost per unit figures are remarkably efficient, community acceptance rates are unprecedented, and the long-term stability indicators suggest this model could be transformative if implemented more broadly." Mayor Rodriguez took over the conversation at this point, her expression conveying both pride and excitement. "Emma, what Jennifer and Marcus are here to discuss is an opportunity that would position you as a national leader in affordable housing policy. The federal government is launching a pilot program to test innovative community development approaches in 15 cities across the country. They've asked Riverside to serve as the lead site, and they want you to direct the entire initiative." The scope of what she was describing felt almost impossible to process. A national pilot program would involve coordination with municipal governments, federal agencies, nonprofit organizations, and community groups across multiple states. The budget implications alone would dwarf anything I'd managed previously, and the policy influence would extend far beyond regional networks to shape federal housing strategy. Jennifer Walsh provided additional details that made the opportunity even more substantial. The pilot program includes a $40 million budget over 3 years, with potential for expansion to additional cities, based on initial results. You would essentially be designing the template for community-driven affordable housing policy that could influence federal funding priorities for decades to come. The position would be based here in Riverside initially, Marcus Thompson added, but would require extensive travel for site visits, stakeholder meetings, and progress evaluation. You'd be working directly with HUD leadership, state housing agencies, and local officials to ensure successful implementation across diverse municipal contexts. As they outlined the responsibilities and expectations, I felt the familiar surge of excitement that accompanied genuinely challenging opportunities. This was work that would require every skill I'd developed over the past several years, from grassroots organizing to policy analysis to stakeholder management, but at a scale that could influence housing outcomes for hundreds of thousands of families nationwide. But beyond the professional significance, I was struck by the personal irony of the moment. 3 years earlier, Jake had dismissed my potential for importance with such casual certainty, suggesting that I was destined for support roles rather than leadership positions that actually matter. Now federal officials were asking me to direct a program that would shape national housing policy and serve as a model for innovative community development approaches across the country. This is an incredible opportunity, I told the assembled group, and I'm honored that you'd consider me for this role. When would you need a decision? Mayor Rodriguez smiled broadly. We were hoping you'd say yes immediately, but we understand this represents a significant career transition. Take the weekend to consider the implications, and let us know by Monday morning. If you accept, we'd want to begin the transition process next week, so you can start the federal position by the first of the year. Walking out of City Hall that evening, I felt as though I was moving through a completely different world than the one I'd inhabited that morning. The quiet community development coordinator who'd once struggled for family recognition was being recruited for a position that would make her one of the most influential housing policy professionals in the country. The transformation felt both surreal and entirely logical, as if every challenge and success over the past 3 years had been preparation for exactly this moment. I called Maya immediately, knowing she'd want to hear the news before I shared it with anyone else. Her reaction was characteristically enthusiastic and direct. "Emma, do you realize what just happened?" She practically shouted into the phone. "You've gone from community organizing to directing national housing policy in less than 4 years. This is the kind of career trajectory that people spend decades building toward, and you've compressed it into the time it takes most people to settle into a single job." Her excitement was infectious, but I also felt a strange sense of calm about the decision. Despite the magnitude of the opportunity and the potential for career advancement, accepting the position felt like a natural next step, rather than a dramatic leap into unknown territory. The work would be more complex and visible, but it would fundamentally involve the same combination of policy analysis, community engagement, and stakeholder coordination that had energized me throughout my time in Riverside. That evening, I sat on my apartment balcony with a glass of wine, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink, while I considered the implications of accepting the federal position. The practical considerations were straightforward. The salary would be substantially higher than my current income, the professional recognition would be invaluable, and the potential for long-term impact was unprecedented, but the personal implications felt equally significant. Accepting this role would represent the final dismantling of Jake's prediction about my limitations, providing incontrovertible evidence that I'd not only achieved importance, but had done so through exactly the kind of community-focused work he'd dismissed as insignificant. The irony wasn't lost on me that federal housing officials had sought me out specifically because of my background in grassroots organizing and community development, the very credentials Jake had characterized as limiting rather than valuable. I decided to wait until after I'd accepted the position before sharing the news with my family. Part of me wanted to savor this achievement privately without immediately subjecting it to their judgment or interpretation, but another part was genuinely curious about how they would respond to news that positioned me as a national expert in policy areas they'd never fully understood or valued. On Monday morning, I called Mayor Rodriguez to accept the federal position, triggering a series of conversations and meetings that would transition my responsibilities and prepare me for the expanded role. The announcement of my appointment generated coverage in housing policy publications nationwide, with several articles highlighting the innovative approaches Riverside had developed under my leadership. The most substantial piece appeared in Governing Magazine, a publication focused on state and local government policy. The article, titled Community-Driven Innovation: How One California City Revolutionized Affordable Housing, featured a photo of me standing in front of one of our scattered site developments, with a caption identifying me as the architect of a new model for inclusive community development. Reading the article felt like seeing my professional evolution documented from an external perspective. The journalist had interviewed residents, developers, city officials, and policy researchers to create a comprehensive analysis of how Riverside's approach differed from conventional affordable housing strategies and why federal officials had selected it as a model for national replication. Chen's background in grassroots organizing gives her a unique perspective on policy implementation. The article quoted a UCLA housing researcher. She understands both the technical requirements of affordable housing finance and the community dynamics that determine whether integration efforts succeed or fail. That combination is extremely rare in this field. Maya brought a copy of the magazine to my office, her expression conveying pride mixed with amazement. "Emma, this article basically positions you as one of the most innovative housing policy thinkers in the country. Do you realize that graduate students are probably going to be reading about your work in urban planning programs?" The idea of my approaches being studied in academic settings felt both gratifying and slightly surreal. Throughout my career, I'd focused on practical problem-solving rather than theoretical innovation, but apparently the solutions we'd developed in Riverside represented significant departures from conventional practice that warranted scholarly attention. The transition period between my municipal and federal roles involved extensive briefings with HUD officials, site visits to other cities, participating in the pilot program, and meetings with community organizations that would be implementing various components of the initiative. Each conversation reinforced my understanding of how unusual my background was within federal housing policy circles. Most officials at this level had either extensive experience in government bureaucracy or backgrounds in real estate development and finance. Few had spent significant time in grassroots organizing or direct community engagement, and many expressed interest in learning about approaches for building authentic resident participation in policy development process. During a particularly valuable conversation with the HUD Deputy Secretary, I realized that my appointment represented more than individual career advancement. Federal housing policy had historically been developed primarily by economists, lawyers, and former real estate professionals, with limited input from people who understood community organizing or had experience navigating the challenges facing low-income families seeking stable housing. Your perspective is exactly what we need to ensure that federal housing investments actually strengthen communities rather than simply producing units, the Deputy Secretary explained during our meeting in Washington, D.C. Too many of our programs have failed because they were designed by people who understood finance and regulation, but not the social dynamics that determine whether affordable housing creates opportunity or perpetuates isolation. These conversations helped me understand that the federal position would involve more than managing a pilot program. I would essentially be advocating for a fundamental shift in how government approaches affordable housing policy, emphasizing community engagement and resident leadership as essential components of successful development, rather than optional add-ons to be considered after financial and regulatory requirements were met. The personal significance of this role became especially clear during my final family dinner before officially transitioning to the federal position. I decided to share the news during our regular monthly gathering, curious to see how my parents and Jake would respond to this latest development in my career trajectory. Walking into the house on Maple Street that Sunday evening, I noticed that the familiar dynamics were still firmly in place. Jake dominated the conversation with updates about his real estate investments and expansion plans, while our parents listened with their characteristic combination of pride and fascination. They asked detailed questions about his market analysis and commission structures, demonstrating engagement with his work that had never extended to my community development effort. When there was finally a lull in Jake's presentation about commercial property trends, I mentioned casually that I'd accepted a new position with the Federal Department of Housing and Urban Development. The announcement initially generated polite interest rather than excitement, with my mother asking if this meant I'd be moving to Washington, D.C., and my father wondering whether government work offered adequate job security. Actually, the position is based here in Riverside initially, I explained, but it involves directing a national pilot program for innovative, affordable housing strategies. HUD selected Riverside as the lead site because of the success we've had with community-driven policy development. Jake looked up from his wine glass with an expression I couldn't immediately interpret. Federal housing policy, he asked. That seems like a pretty significant departure from community organizing. Are you sure you're qualified for that level of responsibility? His question carried the same condescending tone I'd heard countless times before, but for the first time it failed to generate any emotional response. Instead, I felt curious about whether he genuinely didn't understand the scope of what I'd been accomplishing, or whether he was simply unable to acknowledge achievements that challenged his assumptions about our relative capability. The position specifically requires my background in community organizing, I replied calmly. Federal officials recruited me because of my experience developing policies that actually work for the families they're intended to serve. Apparently, that perspective has been missing from federal housing strategy. I went on to describe the pilot program in detail, explaining how my work in Riverside had attracted national attention and positioned me as an expert in community-driven policy development. As I outlined the scope of the initiative and the potential for influencing federal funding priorities, I watched my family's expressions shift from polite interest to genuine surprise. My father was the first to fully grasp the implication. Emma, this sounds like you're going to be advising the federal government on housing policy for the entire country. That's a tremendous responsibility. My mother nodded slowly, her expression conveying a level of recognition I'd rarely seen directed toward my professional accomplishment. I had no idea your work had become so influential. When you said community development, I thought you meant organizing bake sales and neighborhood cleanup. Jake remained quiet throughout this exchange, clearly processing information that didn't align with his long-held assumptions about my career limitations. When he finally spoke, his tone was more subdued than usual. I guess I didn't realize that community organizing could lead to federal policy positions, he admitted. That's actually pretty impressive, Em. The acknowledgement felt both validating and unnecessary. Over the past 3 years, I'd built an identity and career that existed entirely independent of family recognition, discovering that true significance came from the work itself rather than from external validation. Jake's admission that he'd been wrong about my potential was satisfying, but it couldn't compare to the deeper fulfillment I'd found in creating policies that improved people's lives and influenced how entire systems operated. After dinner, as I prepared to leave for my apartment, my father walked me to the car with an expression that suggested he wanted to continue our conversation privately. Emma, I owe you an apology, he said, leaning against my Honda Civic in the driveway where Jake's BMW was still parked prominently. Your mother and I never fully understood the work you were doing, or appreciated how significant your achievements have been. We were so focused on traditional measures of success that we missed what you were actually building. His words carried genuine regret, and I appreciated the acknowledgement even as I recognized that my relationship with family approval had fundamentally changed. I understand why community development seemed less important than real estate or business, I replied, but I've learned that impact isn't always measured by salary or status symbols. Sometimes the most important work happens quietly, in ways that don't generate obvious recognition. You're going to be influencing federal policy, he said, shaking his head with apparent amazement. When you were little, you always said you wanted to help people, but I never imagined it would lead to this level of responsibility. Driving home that evening, I reflected on how dramatically my life had changed since Jake's dismissive comment at their anniversary dinner 3 years earlier. The woman who'd accepted his assessment of her limitations had evolved into someone whose expertise was sought by federal officials and whose innovative approaches were being studied by policy researchers nationwide. But perhaps more importantly, I'd discovered that true significance wasn't something others granted you based on their perception of your potential. It was something you created through persistent effort, strategic thinking, and commitment to goals larger than personal advancement. The recognition from my family felt nice, but it was no longer necessary for my sense of professional identity or personal worth. 6 months into my federal role, I received an invitation that would have seemed impossible during my early career in community development. The mayor's office in Riverside was hosting a reception to honor local leaders who had achieved national recognition for their innovative work. The event would include city council members, business leaders, nonprofit directors, and other residents whose achievements had brought positive attention to the city. Standing in the reception hall at the Riverside Convention Center, surrounded by elected officials and community leaders who sought my input on housing policy questions, I thought about the journey that had brought me to this moment. The quiet community development coordinator who'd once struggled for family recognition had become someone whose opinion was valued by federal officials and whose innovative approaches were influencing policy decisions across the country. Mayor Rodriguez introduced me to the gathered crowd as Riverside's nationally recognized expert in community-driven affordable housing policy, highlighting how my work had positioned the city as a model for innovative approaches to municipal challenge. The applause that followed felt like recognition not just for individual achievements, but for the value of community-focused policy development that prioritized resident voices and long-term neighborhood stability. After the reception, as I walked through downtown Riverside toward my car, I passed the community garden that had been my first major policy success. Seeing families tending vegetables in what had once been an abandoned lot reminded me of why this work had always mattered beyond any personal validation or career advancement. The policies I'd helped create weren't abstract concepts but concrete interventions that allowed people to build stable, dignified lives in communities they value. The most satisfying aspect of my professional evolution wasn't the federal recognition or the media coverage or even my family's belated acknowledgement of my achievement. It was the understanding that I'd found work that utilized my abilities fully while contributing to solutions for challenges that affected thousands of families. The significance Jake had suggested I'd never achieve hadn't come from seeking his approval or competing for family recognition, but from building expertise, developing innovative approaches, and consistently delivering results that improved people's lives. As I reached my car, my phone buzzed with a text message that would punctuate this evening of reflection perfectly. It was from Jake, who had apparently been following news coverage of the federal pilot program. Saw the article about your work in the LA Times, his message. I was wrong about your potential, Em. What you've built is genuinely impressive and I'm proud to be your brother. Reading his words, I felt a complex mixture of satisfaction and detachment. The acknowledgement I'd once craved was finally being offered freely, but it no longer held the power to define my sense of professional worth or personal identity. I'd spent 3 years discovering that true importance wasn't something others granted you based on their perception of your limitations, but something you created through the accumulated impact of your choices, efforts, and commitment to work that mattered. I texted back a simple response: "Thank you. It's been an incredible journey," and it had. The girl who'd once nodded quietly when her brother predicted she'd never be important had become a woman whose innovative work was influencing federal policy and whose expertise was being studied by researchers nationwide. But more significantly, she'd learned that importance wasn't inherited or granted by others, but earned through the patient work of building solutions to problems that mattered, one policy victory and one strengthened community at a time. 2 years into directing the federal affordable housing pilot program, I found myself standing in the East Room of the White House, waiting to meet with President Harris about expanding community-driven housing initiatives nationwide. The invitation had arrived 3 weeks earlier through official channels, but the reality of being in this space still felt surreal. The woman who had once accepted her brother's assessment that she'd never be important was now being consulted by the highest levels of government about policy strategies that could affect millions of American families. The pilot program had exceeded every projected outcome measure. 15 cities across the country had implemented variations of the community engagement model we'd developed in Riverside, and the results were unprecedented. Cost per unit averaged 23% below traditional affordable housing developments, while community acceptance rates exceeded 90% in all participating municipalities. More importantly, long-term stability indicators showed that families placed through these programs maintained housing security at rates that surpassed any comparable federal initiative in the past 2 decades. Secretary Martinez from the Department of Housing and Urban Development had briefed me extensively before this meeting, emphasizing that the president was particularly interested in understanding how resident leadership development could be scaled across different demographic and geographic contexts. The success stories emerging from our pilot sites included urban neighborhoods in Detroit, rural communities in Montana, and suburban areas in North Carolina, demonstrating that community-driven approaches could work across diverse municipal environments. Standing in the East Room, surrounded by portraits of previous presidents and the weight of American political history, I thought about the journey that had brought me to this moment. The quiet dinner table conversation where Jake had dismissed my potential seemed like it had happened in another lifetime, to a different person entirely. The federal recognition I was receiving represented not just personal achievement, but validation of an approach to policy development that prioritized community voice and resident expertise over traditional top-down government strategy. President Harris entered the room with her characteristic combination of warmth and focused intensity, immediately making me feel like this conversation was the most important item on her agenda, despite the countless demands competing for her attention. Chan, thank you for taking time from your busy schedule to meet with us today. Your work on community-driven housing policy has been generating remarkable results across the country. The meeting included several other officials from HUD, the Department of Commerce and the Office of Management and Budget, but President Harris directed most of her questions specifically to me, clearly having studied the program outcomes in detail. Her inquiries demonstrated sophisticated understanding of both the policy mechanisms and the community engagement strategies that made our approach effective. What I find most intriguing about your model, she said, leaning forward across the conference table where we'd assembled, is how it addresses the traditional tension between federal funding requirements and local community needs. Too often our well-intentioned programs create outcomes that communities didn't ask for and can't sustain. Your approach seems to resolve that fundamental disconnect. I explained how resident leadership development had been central to our success, describing the training programs we'd created to help community members navigate policy processes, understand budget implications, and advocate effectively for their priorities. The key insight had been recognizing that sustainable affordable housing required more than just construction funding. It needed community capacity building that enabled residents to influence ongoing decisions about their neighborhood. The most significant breakthrough came when we started treating residents as policy experts rather than program beneficiaries. I told the president, people who live in communities understand the nuances of local dynamics in ways that outside developers and government officials often miss. When we center their expertise in the planning process, we create solutions that actually work long-term. President Harris nodded thoughtfully, taking notes on points she wanted to follow up on. This connects to broader themes in our domestic policy agenda, about ensuring that federal investments strengthen communities, rather than disrupting them. How do you see this approach scaling to address housing challenges in major metropolitan areas? The question allowed me to share findings from our pilot sites in Chicago, Atlanta, and Phoenix, where we'd successfully adapted community engagement strategies to neighborhoods with diverse demographic compositions and complex political dynamics. The scalability had been one of our most significant discoveries, demonstrating that resident-centered approaches could work across different urban contexts when properly supported with training and resources. Our conversation continued for nearly an hour, covering everything from federal budget implications to potential legislative priorities that could support broader implementation of community-driven housing strategy. By the time the meeting concluded, President Harris had asked me to work with her domestic policy team on developing a comprehensive proposal for expanding these approaches through existing federal programs. Walking out of the White House that afternoon, I felt a sense of professional fulfillment that extended far beyond any personal recognition or career advancement. The work I'd been doing for the past several years had evolved from local community organizing to influencing national policy conversations about how government could better serve the communities it was intended to help. The impact was no longer measured in individual families or even single municipalities,
but in the potential to reshape how federal resources were allocated and how community voices were incorporated into policy development process. The flight back to California gave me time to reflect on the personal transformation I'd experienced over the past 5 years. The woman who had once nodded quietly when her brother predicted she'd never be important had become someone whose expertise was sought by the President of the United States.
But more significantly, I'd discovered that true importance wasn't about recognition or status symbols, but about building work that created meaningful change in people's lives. Maya met me at the airport in Los Angeles, eager to hear about the White House meeting and its implications for our ongoing projects. Her excitement was infectious as I described the president's interest in scaling our community engagement model and the potential for federal legislation that could support similar initiatives nationwide. "Emma, do you realize what this means?" she said as we drove through evening traffic toward Riverside. "You're not just implementing policy anymore, you're helping to create the framework for how the federal government approaches community development. This is the kind of influence that shapes policy for generations." Her observation highlighted something I'd been gradually recognizing about my evolving role. The combination of grassroots organizing experience and federal policy expertise had positioned me uniquely to bridge the gap between community needs and government resources. Federal officials valued my understanding of how policies actually functioned in neighborhoods, while community organizations trusted my commitment to resident-centered approaches that prioritized local priorities over bureaucratic convenience. This positioning became especially valuable as I began working with the White House domestic policy team to develop comprehensive recommendations for expanding community-driven housing initiatives. The proposal we crafted over the following months included legislative language that would require meaningful community engagement in all federally funded housing developments, along with dedicated funding streams for resident leadership training and ongoing capacity building. The process of developing federal policy recommendations provided insights into how government actually functioned at the highest levels, revealing both the opportunities and constraints involved in creating systemic change. Every proposal had to be evaluated not just for its policy merits, but for its political feasibility, budget implications, and potential unintended consequences across diverse constituencies. Working with White House staff required adapting my communication style to audience members who understood federal budget processes and congressional dynamics, but often lacked direct experience with community organizing or affordable housing development. I found myself serving as a translator between the technical language of policy analysis and the practical realities of how families experienced housing insecurity and neighborhood change. The most challenging aspect of this work involved addressing skepticism from officials who questioned whether community engagement could be efficiently scaled across thousands of municipalities with varying political climates and administrative capacity. Some argued that resident involvement would slow down development processes and complicate federal oversight requirements, potentially reducing the total number of affordable housing units that could be produced with available funding. These concerns required careful responses that demonstrated how upfront community engagement actually accelerated long-term project success by reducing conflicts, building local support, and creating social infrastructure that sustained affordable housing investments over time. I developed presentations using data from our pilot sites to show that community-driven developments experienced significantly fewer delays, cost overruns, and post-construction problems compared to traditional affordable housing projects. The breakthrough came during a meeting with congressional staff members who were working on housing legislation for the upcoming session. Representative Johnson from Michigan, who chaired the House Subcommittee on Housing and Urban Development, had requested a briefing on innovative approaches to federal housing policy that could generate bipartisan support. "Chen, what you're describing sounds like exactly the kind of practical solution that could work across different political contexts," she said after I'd presented findings from our rural and suburban pilot site. "Community engagement isn't a partisan issue when it's focused on ensuring that federal investments actually serve local needs." Her support proved crucial for building broader congressional interest in our recommendation. Within weeks, her office had organized briefings with representatives from both parties who were interested in housing policy innovations that could demonstrate effective use of federal resources while respecting local autonomy and community priority. The legislative process moved more quickly than I'd expected, with key provisions from our recommendations being incorporated into the Affordable Housing Innovation Act that was introduced in both chambers of Congress. The bill included funding for community engagement training programs, requirements for resident involvement in federally funded housing developments, and pilot funding for community land trusts and other innovative ownership models. Testifying before Congress about the bill represented another milestone in my professional evolution. Standing at the witness table in the House hearing room, surrounded by representatives who would be voting on legislation that incorporated ideas I'd helped develop, I thought about how far I'd traveled from the community development coordinator who'd once struggled for family recognition. Chairman, ranking member, and distinguished committee members, I began my testimony. The community-driven housing model represents a fundamental shift from treating residents as passive beneficiaries of federal programs to recognizing them as essential partners in creating sustainable solutions to housing challenges. The questions from committee members demonstrated genuine interest in understanding how resident engagement could be implemented practically across different contexts. Representatives from rural districts wanted to know how the model worked in small towns, while urban representatives focused on applications in complex metropolitan areas with multiple jurisdictions and competing interests. The most pointed question came from Representative Davis, who expressed concern about potential delays and administrative complexities. Chen, while community engagement sounds admirable in theory, how do we ensure that it doesn't become another layer of bureaucracy that slows down housing production when we have a national affordability crisis? I'd anticipated this concern and had prepared response materials that directly addressed it. Representative Davis, our pilot data shows that community engagement actually accelerates project timelines by identifying and resolving potential conflicts before they become expensive delays. Projects that invest in upfront community input experience 28% fewer change orders and 35% shorter approval processes compared to traditional development. The hearing concluded with bipartisan expressions of support for the innovative approaches we'd developed, and within 6 months the Affordable Housing Innovation Act had passed both chambers of Congress with overwhelming majority. The bill signing ceremony at the White House included representatives from several pilot site communities, along with housing advocates and municipal officials who had supported the legislation. Standing in the Rose Garden as President Harris signed the bill into law, I felt a profound sense of accomplishment that extended far beyond personal achievement. The legislation would affect housing policy for decades to come, ensuring that community voices would be central to federal housing investments, and that resident expertise would be valued in policy development process. The personal significance of this moment became even more meaningful when I noticed my parents in the crowd of invited guests. They had flown to Washington at my invitation, and seeing them witness this culmination of my professional journey felt like a full-circle moment that addressed years of feeling overlooked and undervalued. After the ceremony, my father approached me with an expression of pride and amazement that I'd rarely seen directed toward my accomplishments. "Emma, I have to admit that I never fully understood what you were building with your community work. Watching you today, seeing how your ideas have become federal law, I realize how wrong I was about the significance of what you've been doing." My mother nodded in agreement, her eyes bright with tears. "We're so proud of you, honey. You've accomplished something truly remarkable. And you did it by helping people and strengthening communities. That's the kind of success that really matters." Their recognition felt gratifying, but it also highlighted how my relationship with family approval had fundamentally changed over the past 5 years. The validation I'd once craved was being offered freely, but it no longer held the power to define my sense of professional worth or personal identity. I'd learned that true significance came from the work itself and its impact on people's lives, not from external acknowledgement of my achievement. Jake, who had also attended the ceremony, waited until we had a moment alone to share his thoughts. I owe you a major apology," he said, his tone carrying genuine regret. "What I said at dinner 5 years ago about you never being important was completely wrong. You've become one of the most influential people in housing policy, and you did it through exactly the kind of community-focused work I dismissed as unimportant." His apology felt both meaningful and unnecessary. The woman who had once been hurt by his dismissive assessment had evolved into someone whose identity existed entirely independent of family recognition. "I appreciate you saying that, Jake, but I've learned that importance isn't something others grant you based on their perception of your potential. It's something you create through the work you choose to do and the impact you have on people's lives." The months following the bill signing brought new opportunities and responsibilities as federal agencies began implementing the community engagement requirement. I was appointed to serve on the National Housing Policy Advisory Council, a newly created body that would oversee implementation of the innovative approaches now required by federal law. The role involved traveling to cities across the country to provide technical assistance and training for municipal officials, community organizations, and resident leaders who were learning to work together in new ways. Each site visit revealed different challenges and opportunities, but the underlying theme remained consistent. When communities were given genuine voice and policy development, they created solutions that worked better for everyone involved. One of the most meaningful visits was to Detroit, where a pilot site had evolved into a comprehensive neighborhood revitalization effort, led by resident councils with significant decision-making authority over federal investment. Walking through the Corktown neighborhood with Maria Santos, a community leader who had become a recognized expert in resident-driven development, I saw firsthand how policy changes could transform entire communities. 5 years ago, this neighborhood was losing population and businesses every month. Maria explained as we toured new affordable housing developments that had been designed entirely through community input process. "Now we have a waiting list of families who want to move here, and local businesses are thriving because residents had voice in planning mixed-use developments that actually serve our needs." The transformation was visible in renovated housing units, thriving local businesses, and public spaces that reflected community priorities rather than generic development standards. But the deeper change was in the capacity of residents to influence ongoing decisions about their neighborhood, ensuring that future investments would continue to reflect local values and priorities. These success stories became central to my work as a national advocate for community-driven policy development. I was invited to speak at conferences, universities, and policy forums about the lessons learned from our pilot programs and the potential for scaling resident-centered approaches across different policy areas beyond housing. The most rewarding speaking engagement came at UC Davis, my alma mater, where I addressed graduate students in the Community Development Program about careers in policy advocacy and social change. Standing in the same lecture hall where I'd first learned about housing policy and community organizing, I reflected on the journey that had brought me from student to nationally recognized expert in the field. "The most important lesson I can share with you," I told the audience of aspiring community development professionals, "is that significance isn't inherited or granted by others based on their assessment of your potential. It's created through persistent effort, strategic thinking, and commitment to work that improves people's lives. The path may not look like traditional career advancement, but the impact can be transformation." After the lecture, several students approached me with questions about transitioning from grassroots organizing to policy work, and I was struck by how many of them faced similar challenges to what I'd experienced early in my career. Young women, particularly those from immigrant families or non-traditional backgrounds, often struggled with family expectations about career paths and professional success. "My parents want me to go to law school because they think community organizing isn't a real career," one student confided. "How do you handle family members who don't understand the importance of this work?" Her question brought back memories of my own struggles with family recognition, and the years I'd spent trying to earn respect from people who'd already decided my work wasn't valuable. "Focus on building work that matters to you and creates real change," I advised. "Family understanding may come eventually, but it can't be your motivation. The work itself has to be meaningful enough to sustain you through periods when others don't see its value." This conversation reminded me that my story wasn't just about personal achievement, but about demonstrating that non-traditional career paths could lead to significant influence and impact. The recognition I'd received from federal officials and policy researchers was meaningful, but perhaps more importantly, My journey showed that community-focused work could create pathways to national leadership that didn't require abandoning values of social justice and resident empowerment. As I prepared to leave the UC Davis campus that evening, I received a text message that would add another dimension to my reflection on the past 5 years. It was from Jake, who had been following news coverage of my speaking engagement. "Saw the article about your lecture at UC Davis," his message read. "I keep thinking about how wrong I was about your potential 5 years ago. You've built something truly impressive, and I'm proud to be your brother. More importantly, you've shown me that success isn't just about individual achievement, but about creating change that helps other people. That's a lesson I needed to learn." His words carried a recognition that extended beyond my professional accomplishments to acknowledge the values and approaches that had guided my career decisions. The brother who had once dismissed community organizing as insignificant was now expressing appreciation for work that prioritized collective benefit over individual advancement. Driving back to Riverside that evening, I thought about the transformations that had occurred not just in my own life but in my family's understanding of what constituted meaningful work. The dinner table conversation where Jake had predicted I'd never be important had become the catalyst for a journey that challenged all of our assumptions about significance, success, and the kinds of careers that could influence policy at the highest levels of government. The house on Maple Street looked exactly the same as it had 5 years earlier, but the dynamics inside had changed dramatically. My parents now followed my work closely, sharing articles about federal housing policy with their friends and expressing genuine interest in understanding the complexities of community development. Jake had begun incorporating some of the community engagement strategies I'd developed into his own real estate projects, recognizing that involving residents in planning processes could create more successful and sustainable development. But perhaps the most meaningful change was in my own relationship with family approval. The recognition I'd once craved was now being offered freely, but it no longer held the power to define my sense of professional worth or personal identity. I'd spent 5 years learning that true importance came from the work itself and its impact on people's lives, not from external validation of my achievement. Standing in my childhood bedroom that night, looking at the certificates and awards that now covered one wall, I realized that the journey from dismissed little sister to nationally recognized policy expert had been about more than proving Jake wrong. It had been about discovering that significance wasn't something others granted you based on their perception of your limitations, but something you created through the accumulated impact of your choices, efforts, and commitment to work that improved people's lives. The phone call that had started this reflection came full circle 6 months later when I received an invitation to serve as senior advisor to the Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, a position that would make me one of the most influential housing policy officials in the federal government. The role would involve overseeing implementation of community-driven approaches across all federal housing programs, ensuring that the innovations we'd developed through pilot programs became standard practice for government investments nationwide. Accepting the position felt like a natural next step rather than a dramatic career transition. The work would be more complex and visible, but it would fundamentally involve the same combination of policy analysis, community engagement, and stakeholder coordination that had energized me throughout my career in Riverside and my federal pilot program work. The appointment ceremony took place in the Secretary's office at HUD headquarters, with representatives from community organizations, municipal governments, and housing advocacy groups in attendance. Secretary Martinez introduced me as a leader who has revolutionized how federal housing policy incorporates community voice and resident expertise, highlighting how my background in grassroots organizing had prepared me for this senior policy role. Standing in that office surrounded by colleagues and community leaders who had supported my work over the past several years, I felt a profound sense of gratitude for the journey that had brought me to this moment. The woman who had once nodded quietly when her brother predicted she'd never be important had become someone whose innovative approaches were being implemented across the federal government, and whose expertise was influencing policy decisions that would affect millions of American families. But the most satisfying aspect of this appointment wasn't the recognition or the influence it represented. It was the knowledge that I'd found work that utilized my abilities fully while contributing to solutions for challenges that mattered deeply to communities across the country.
The significance Jake had suggested I'd never achieve hadn't come from seeking his approval or competing for family recognition, but from building expertise, developing innovative approaches, and consistently delivering results that improved people's lives. As I prepared to take on this new role, I thought about the community development coordinator who had once struggled for family recognition and the federal official who was now helping to shape national housing policy. The transformation had been gradual but profound, built through thousands of small decisions to prioritize community voice, invest in resident capacity, and create policies that actually worked for the people they were intended to serve. The journey from Maple Street to the federal government had taught me that importance wasn't inherited or granted by others, but earned through the patient work of building solutions to problems that matter. And that lesson, more than any recognition or appointment, would guide my work as I continued to advocate for communities and families who deserved to have their voices heard in the corridors of power where policies affecting their lives were made. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.